A billionaire loses his wife during childbirth and is forced to raise a blind and fragile baby alone. But a newly hired employee starts to notice something about the baby that no one had ever perceived. What seemed like an irreversible tragedy conceals a medical error capable of changing everything. And when he discovers the truth, his revenge becomes headline news worldwide. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. Maurice Kensington gazed at the City of London through the enormous windows of his penthouse in Hampstead. The grey sky perfectly reflected his state of mind. 3 months had passed since the plane crash that took his wife, Anna Louise, as she returned from a medical conference in Edinburgh. The private jet crashed in a mountainous region of the Scottish Highlands, leaving no survivors except for the baby Anna Louise carried in her womb, saved by an emergency C-section performed by paramedics who quickly arrived at the scene. Little Michael came into the world amidst a tragedy. He was born prematurely at 7 months in precarious conditions. He survived by a miracle, the doctors said. But apparently, this miracle was only half fulfilled. After countless examinations, the medical verdict was unanimous. Total blindness, Mr. Kensington. Eleanor, the housekeeper's voice, interrupted his gloomy thoughts. Dr. Henry Maxwell is here for Michael's weekly visit. Maurice nodded without turning around. Dr. Henry Maxwell was London's most renowned pediatric ophthalmologist, a middle-aged man, always impeccable in his expensive suits and with an unshakable reputation in the medical community. He was the one who had confirmed the initial diagnosis and prescribed a rigorous regimen of care, including special eye drops that he claimed could preserve ocular health, even in the absence of vision. Send him in. The doctor entered the office with his usual confident demeanor. Good morning, Maurice. How is our little warrior today? The same as yesterday. And every other day. The businessman's harshness was evident in his voice. He doesn't cry, doesn't smile, doesn't react to light, doesn't follow sounds, nothing. Dr. Henry placed his briefcase on the marble table. I understand your frustration, but we need to be patient. Michael's condition is irreversible, I know. You tell me that every visit. Shall we see him? Maurice led the doctor down the wide corridor, decorated with expensive artworks that no longer stirred any emotion in him. In the room prepared to be as comfortable as possible, little Michael remained motionless in his crib. A baby with fair skin, brown hair, and blue eyes inherited from his mother that remained fixed on nothingness. The doctor examined the boy with mechanical, efficient movements, checking his eyes with small flashlights, testing reflexes, and finally applying the prescribed eye drops. Everything continues as expected, he announced, putting away his instruments. Maintain the eye drop regimen. 3 drops in each eye in the morning, at noon, and at night. It's essential for his ocular health. What about the stimuli I've been trying? Music, different textures, sound toys? Nothing works. Keep trying, but don't hold on to false hopes. The optic nerve damage is complete, confirmed by 3 different exams. I advise you to start accepting reality, Maurice. After the doctor left, the businessman returned to his son's room. For weeks, he had refused to hire specialized nurses or nannies, dedicating all his time to little Michael. His company, Kensington Tech, one of the largest in the country's technology sector, was being managed remotely, with minimal and only strictly necessary decisions. The mansion, which once hosted parties and business meetings, was now a silent and gloomy place, almost a mausoleum. The staff moved through the premises with soft steps and low voices, as if fearing to disturb the mourning that permeated every room. Sir? Eleanor appeared again. About the new employee I mentioned. What employee? Maurice asked without taking his eyes off his son. The young woman to assist with internal duties. Remember Maria retired last month? We need someone to replace her. Maurice nodded distractedly. Whatever. Hire whoever you think is best. She'll arrive tomorrow. Her name is Deborah Shaw. She seems like a very dedicated young woman. The next day, as Maurice tried unsuccessfully to make Michael react to a musical toy, he heard soft knocks on the nursery door. Eleanor entered, accompanied by a young woman of approximately 30, medium height, dark skin, and black hair tied in a simple bun. Mr. Kensington, this is Deborah Shaw. The woman gave a slight nod. Good morning, sir. There was something in her expression that caught Maurice's attention, a deep sadness, controlled but present in her brown eyes. It wasn't the kind of servile gaze he expected from an employee, but of someone who carried her own pain. "Eleanor must have explained your duties," he said, turning his attention back to Michael. "My only requirement is that you respect the silence of this house." "I understand, sir." In the days that followed, Deborah performed her tasks with efficiency and discretion. Maurice barely noticed her presence around the house, except when he occasionally encountered her in the hallways or kitchen. She always greeted him politely and went about her way. A week after her arrival, Maurice surprised her looking at Michael through the half-open nursery door. "Is there a problem?" he asked, making her jump. "Forgive me, sir. I didn't mean to intrude." She hesitated. "It's just... he reminds me of my son." There was something in the way she pronounced those words that sparked an instant connection. "You have a son?" A shadow crossed Deborah's face. "I did, Lewis Edward. He passed away 6 months ago. He was only 3 months old." Maurice felt an unexpected empathy. Here was someone who understood, even partially, his pain. "I'm so sorry," she nodded. "I'm also sorry for you and for little Michael. Eleanor told me about his condition." There was a moment of shared silence, the kind of silence that only people who have known profound loss can truly understand. "May I ask something, sir?" Deborah finally broke the silence. "This diagnosis, was it confirmed by more than one doctor? By the best in the country? Why do you ask?" She looked away. "For nothing specific. It's just that in life sometimes we accept truths that aren't as absolute as they seem." Before Maurice could question the enigmatic meaning of those words, the phone rang. It was from his company, an urgent matter that required his immediate attention. When he looked for Deborah again, she had already returned to her tasks, leaving only the echo of that intriguing comment in the air. That night, lying in his king-size bed, Maurice reflected on the new employee's words. Could there be any possibility, however remote, that the doctors were wrong? Was it just a father's desperation, seeking a thread of hope where none existed? The sound of the intercom interrupted his thoughts. It was Eleanor, informing him that Dr. Henry had called to confirm his visit the next day and to remind him of the importance of not missing Michael's nightly medication. Maurice got up and went to his son's room. The baby was lying motionless as always, staring into nothingness with those blue eyes that seemed never to blink. Following the established routine, he picked up the eye drop bottle from the bedside table and applied the 3 drops to each of the boy's eyes. As he watched his son after the medication, he couldn't help but wonder if he was truly doing everything he could for him. The mansion, once full of life and dreams for the future, now seemed like a prison of sadness and resignation. "We'll find a way, son," he whispered, gently stroking Michael's face. "Somehow we will find it." The next morning, Deborah started her household chores earlier than usual. As she cleaned the mansion's corridors, her thoughts remained fixed on little Michael. There was something about the baby's behavior that deeply intrigued her, something that went beyond the diagnosis of blindness. During the years she worked as a nursing assistant in a daycare in the suburbs of London, before dedicating herself exclusively to her son, Louis Edward, Deborah had interacted with 2 visually impaired children. She remembered their behaviors well, how they reacted to sounds, how they expressed emotions, how they sought contact. Michael was different. His immobility, his lost gaze, the total absence of curiosity, all of this seemed to indicate something beyond blindness. The sound of the doorbell interrupted her thoughts. It was Dr. Henry arriving for his scheduled visit. Eleanor led him to Maurice's office, and Deborah took the opportunity to discreetly approach the door, pretending to clean a nearby vase. Fragments of the conversation between the businessman and the doctor reached her. "Minimal evolution, as expected," Dr. Henry was saying in a clinical tone. "But there should be some reaction to sounds. At least," Maurice argued with a note of desperation in his voice, "each case is unique. The trauma of birth in the circumstances that occurred may have caused—" Deborah moved away when she noticed Eleanor approaching down the corridor. She didn't want to be caught eavesdropping, especially in her first days of work. But something in that conversation deeply bothered her. Later, while organizing the pantry, she heard Eleanor call, "Deborah, could you take these clean towels to the baby's room?" Mr. Kensington left for an emergency meeting at the company and asked us to check on Michael every hour. Of course, ma'am. That was the opportunity Deborah had been waiting for. She entered the room where Michael was silently. The environment was impeccably decorated, with exclusive designer furniture, walls in soft tones, and an impressive variety of educational toys, many of them still in their packaging. A room that revealed both the father's purchasing power and his desperate search for anything that could stimulate his son. Michael was lying in his crib on his back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Deborah approached slowly, placing the towels on a nearby armchair. Instead of leaving, she moved closer to the crib. "Hi, Michael," she whispered softly. "It's me, Deborah." As expected, there was no response. No movement, no different blink. Nothing to indicate that the baby had noticed her presence. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, Deborah extended her hand and lightly brushed her finger across the boy's face. No reaction. It was then that she noticed on the dresser the bottle of eye drops the doctor had prescribed. Carefully she picked it up to examine it. The label was partially worn, making it difficult to read some of the components. The expiration date, however, was perfectly visible. The medication had expired almost a month ago. A renowned doctor like Dr. Henry prescribing expired eye drops? She murmured to herself, intrigued. She put the bottle back exactly as it was and continued observing Michael. According to Eleanor, the baby had just received his midday dose applied by his father before leaving. Deborah knew from her experience that typical eye drops for ocular humidification usually had an almost immediate effect. But what if these weren't ordinary eye drops? An idea began to form in her mind, but she would need more observations to confirm it. She decided she would return later, when the effect of the eye drops would possibly be diminishing. Throughout the rest of the afternoon, Deborah completed her tasks efficiently, but her mind was divided. At every opportunity she passed by Michael's room, observing him briefly. In the first hours after the eye drop application, the baby remained absolutely motionless. Around 4 in the afternoon, however, Deborah noticed something subtle. Michael's fingers moved slightly when a ray of sunlight, entering through the curtain gap, hit his face. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a reaction. When Morris returned in the early evening, he found Deborah leaving his son's room. "Is there a problem?" he asked, with the natural suspicion of someone unaccustomed to seeing staff in that area of the house. "No, sir. Eleanor asked me to check on the baby periodically. I just changed his diaper." Morris nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you. It's been difficult." "I imagine, sir." Deborah hesitated, carefully choosing her words. "If I may make a suggestion, perhaps a warm bath would help him relax before bedtime." "I used to do that with my Louis Edward." A flash of pain crossed Maurice's face at the mention of the son Deborah had lost. "I suppose we could try. I can prepare everything if you wish." Half an hour later, Deborah had filled the small bathtub in Michael's room with warm water. With Maurice's permission, she carefully undressed the baby and placed him in the water. "Hold him like this," she instructed, showing Maurice how to support his son's head and body. The water should give him a sense of security, like in the womb. As Maurice held Michael, Deborah began to gently pass a sponge over the baby's body, softly humming a lullaby. The businessman watched every movement attentively, as if trying to memorize the procedure to repeat it alone in the future. It was during this tranquil moment that it happened. A small amount of foam touched Michael's eye area, and, to their astonishment, the baby blinked. Not only that, but his face contracted slightly, as if reacting to the sensation. "Did you see that?" Deborah exclaimed, unable to contain her excitement. "He blinked?" Maurice replied, incredulous. "It's a normal reflex," Deborah explained, trying to contain her own excitement so as not to create false hopes. "Even people with total blindness have preserved ocular reflexes." But in her mind, the pieces began to fit together. The foam had done what the light hadn't, provoked a reaction. What if the problem wasn't in the optic nerve as diagnosed? What if it was something related to that eye drop bottle with the worn label and expired date? After the bath, Deborah wrapped Michael in a soft towel and handed him to his father. To her surprise, the baby emitted a guttural sound, something between a grunt and a sigh of satisfaction. "He made a sound," Maurice commented, his expression lighting up for an instant. "Babies make these sounds spontaneously," Deborah replied cautiously. But it's always a good sign of comfort. After Morris dressed his son in pajamas and put him in the crib, Deborah noticed that he didn't apply the nightly eye drops. When questioned about it, the businessman explained, "Dr. Henry called earlier today. He said we can reduce it to 2 daily applications from now on, morning and afternoon only." That sudden change in prescription only increased Deborah's suspicions. Why reduce the dosage precisely when the baby was beginning to show signs, however minimal, of reactivity? "I understand," she simply replied. That night, after finishing her shift, Deborah did not go directly to the small apartment she rented in Camden Town. Instead, she went to the municipal library, which stayed open late. She sat in front of one of the computers and began researching pediatric eye drops. Most of the results dealt with medications for infections, allergies, or ocular humidification. Nothing that seemed relevant to a case of supposed blindness due to optic nerve damage. It was when she decided to research the side effects of eye drops in general that she found something interesting. Certain components, in specific concentrations, could cause temporary blurring of vision, reduced light sensitivity, and in rare cases, lethargy. Lethargy, she repeated softly. It was exactly what Michael exhibited, an apathy, a lack of reaction that went beyond what was expected for a blind baby. Deborah copied the information into her notebook and left the library with her mind buzzing with ideas and hypotheses. On the bus ride home, a certainty began to form. There was something wrong with those eye drops, with that diagnosis, with the entire situation. And she needed to find out what it was before it was too late for little Michael. In her simple apartment, where she still kept the room she had prepared for Louis Edward untouched, Deborah sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the photo of her son she kept on the bedside table. "Help me see what no one else is seeing," she whispered, stroking the portrait. "Perhaps that's why I ended up in that house. To help that baby as I couldn't help you." With this renewed determination, Deborah planned her next step, to carefully observe Michael's behavior pattern in the hours following the eye drop application and document any reaction, no matter how small. And more importantly, to get a closer look at that mysterious bottle. Her intuition told her she was on the right track. And for the first time since the loss of her son, Deborah felt a renewed purpose in her life. Over the next 2 weeks, Deborah developed a discreet system for monitoring Michael's reactions. In a small notebook she kept hidden in her pocket, she meticulously noted the times of eye drop applications, the baby's behavior immediately after, and the gradual changes she observed as the hours passed. The pattern was undeniable. Immediately after receiving the drops, Michael became even more apathetic, almost lethargic. His breathing became slower. His few bodily reactions disappeared completely. It was as if the medication, instead of helping, was sedating the baby. Even more intriguing was what happened approximately 4 to 5 hours after each application. Small signs of reactivity began to emerge. A slight movement of his fingers when a loud sound occurred nearby. A subtle facial contraction when Deborah passed a damp towel over his face. Nothing that could be considered definitive proof, but enough to fuel her suspicions. The daily bath became a ritual observed with special attention. Maurice, initially hesitant, now actively participated in these moments. Following Deborah's guidance and noticing himself the small changes in his son's behavior. One sunny afternoon, while bathing Michael, Deborah deliberately allowed a little more foam to form in the water and approach the baby's eyes. The reaction was more evident this time, not just a blink but an eye movement, as if he was trying to follow the trajectory of the foam. "Ma!" A sound escaped Michael's lips, something that could be interpreted as mere babbling, but which to Deborah sounded almost like an attempt to pronounce "Mama." "Did you hear that?" Maurice asked, stunned. Deborah nodded, maintaining her composure. Babies this age start experimenting with sounds. It's a good sign of cognitive development, regardless of vision. After the bath, while Maurice dried his son, Deborah took the opportunity to re-examine the eye drop bottle on the dresser. More calmly this time, she managed to decipher part of the worn label, hydrochloride of... The rest was illegible, but that was a start. That night at home, she researched medications containing hydrochloride used in ophthalmology. The list was extensive, but filtering for pediatric use and related to optic nerve damage, She found mentions of an experimental compound called modified phenylephrine hydrochloride, used in some clinical studies for specific cases of pediatric glaucoma. Among the listed side effects were possible temporary reduction in light sensitivity, blurring of vision at high doses, and, what most caught her attention, may cause significant reduction in pupillary response in infants. The next day, Deborah arrived at the mansion earlier than usual. She knew Dr. Henry would make his weekly visit and was determined to closely observe the doctor's interaction with Michael. From the half-open door of the room, she saw the doctor perform the routine examination. His movements were quick, almost mechanical, and at no point did he seem to notice or value the small behavioral changes that she and Maurice had recorded during the week. Maintain the current eye drop regimen. Deborah heard the doctor instruct Maurice. It is essential to avoid secondary complications. But he has shown some reactions, Maurice argued. Yesterday during the bath he made a sound that almost seemed like a word. Dr. Henry adjusted his glasses impatiently. Mr. Kensington, I understand your hope, but we must be realistic. The exams are conclusive. What you are interpreting as conscious reactions are merely basic neurological reflexes, independent of vision. Deborah clenched her fists, containing her indignation. How could the doctor so easily dismiss signs of progress? How could he be so certain of that bleak diagnosis? After the doctor left, Maurice remained in Michael's room, sitting on the edge of the crib with a defeated expression. Deborah approached cautiously. Are you all right? Maurice looked up, his eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and frustration. For a moment I really believed that there was some hope. What if there is? Deborah asked, knowing she was risking her job by openly challenging the diagnosis of a renowned doctor. What do you mean? Deborah hesitated, organizing her thoughts. Mr. Kensington, in the past few days I have been observing Michael very carefully. There is a pattern in his behavior that doesn't seem consistent with total blindness. Maurice straightened up, suddenly interested. What pattern? Immediately after receiving the eye drops, he becomes completely apathetic. But as the hours pass, small reactions begin to emerge. During the bath especially, he seems more responsive. That could be explained in several ways, Maurice pondered, still skeptical. The warmth of the water, the comfort. Yes, it could, but there's more. Deborah took a deep breath before continuing. Sir, the eye drops Dr. Henry prescribed have been expired for almost 2 months. What? Maurice's expression instantly changed to shock and indignation. And more importantly, she continued, I'm not sure if this is the appropriate medication for Michael's condition. I did some research, and the listed components can have effects that, instead of helping, could be suppressing any residual vision he might have. Maurice stood up, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of agitation. Are you suggesting that Dr. Henry is, treating my son improperly? Why? What would be the reason? I don't know, Deborah admitted. But something isn't right, and I believe we should at least consider seeking a second opinion. Another specialist who is not related to Dr. Henry. Maurice walked to the window, observing the impeccably maintained garden of the mansion. The afternoon sun illuminated the colorful flowers, creating a contrast with the tense atmosphere inside the room. When he turned around, his expression had changed. There was determination where before there had only been resignation. What do you suggest we do? First, Deborah began, relieved to have been heard, we could try skipping one application of the eye drops. See how Michael reacts in the following hours. What if that's harmful? The eye drops are already expired, sir. Continuing to apply them could be more harmful than temporarily suspending them. Furthermore, we can observe him constantly, and at the slightest sign of discomfort, we resume the medication. Maurice pondered for a few moments, the internal conflict evident on his face. Finally, he nodded. Let's try. The afternoon application would be in an hour. We'll skip that dose and see what happens. The next few hours were of intense vigilance. Deborah and Maurice took turns observing Michael, attentive to any sign of discomfort or significant change. Eleanor, the housekeeper, cast curious glances at the pair, but remained discreet in her questioning. Around 6 in the evening, the time when the effects of the morning eye drops would normally begin to diminish, something extraordinary happened. A ray of setting sun entering through the window shone directly on Michael's face. And for the first time, The baby not only blinked but lightly turned his head, as if searching for the source of that light. "My God," Maurice whispered, holding his breath. "Did you see that?" Deborah nodded, tears in her eyes. "He's reacting to the light, Mr. Kensington." Motivated by that small victory, they decided to perform another test. Deborah picked up one of the decorative lanterns in the room and, very carefully, directed the beam of light to the side of the crib, never directly into the baby's eyes. Michael turned his head again, this time more pronouncedly, following the movement of the lantern. The shy smile, his first, formed on his lips, and he emitted a sound that seemed almost like a giggle. Maurice brought his hands to his face, unable to contain his emotion. "He can see," he murmured, his voice choked. "My son can see." That night was one of restrained celebration and intense planning. Determined to confirm their suspicions, Maurice and Deborah established a new regimen. They would completely suspend the use of the eye drops and document every reaction of Michael over the next 48 hours. "If Dr. Henry calls, I'll say I'm following the prescription normally," Maurice decided. "Meanwhile, I'll seek another specialist for an independent evaluation." "I know someone who can help," Deborah offered. "Dr. Felicity Oliver. She worked at St. Thomas's Hospital and now has a specialized pediatric ophthalmology clinic in Notting Hill. She's known for her independent and questioning approach." Maurice wrote down the name. "I'll contact her tomorrow." "And Deborah," he paused, searching for the right words. "Thank you. You saw what no one else could see." That night, while Maurice slept for the first time in months with a thread of hope in his heart, Deborah remained awake in her apartment, reviewing her notes and researching more about modified phenylephrine hydrochloride. Information was scarce, but enough to confirm her initial suspicions. In high doses or prolonged use, the compound could effectively suppress visual responses, especially in pediatric patients. "Why would someone prescribe this for a supposedly blind child?" she murmured to herself as the first rays of sun began to appear on the horizon. The answer to that question was too disturbing to be contemplated at that moment. But Deborah was determined to find it, not only for Michael's sake, but for all the children who might be receiving the same misguided treatment. With a light heart for the first time in a long while, she prepared for another day at the Kensington mansion. A day that, she knew, could mark the beginning of a journey of discovery and, she hoped, of redemption for little Michael. The following morning brought a completely new atmosphere to the Kensington mansion. The curtains, which for months had remained half closed to protect Michael's sensitive eyes, were now partially open, allowing natural light to illuminate the rooms. Maurice had woken before sunrise, eager to observe his son's reactions on a new day without the eye drops. Deborah arrived promptly at 7, finding the businessman already in Michael's room, holding the baby, moving slowly from one side of the room to the other. "Good morning," she greeted softly. "How was his night?" "Incredibly well," Maurice replied, with a smile he hadn't worn in a long time. "He woke up twice as usual, but when I picked him up, he looked at me, Deborah." "I have no doubt." His eyes followed my face. Deborah approached, observing the baby with professional attention. Michael seemed more alert, his blue eyes moving around the room with a new curiosity. When she leaned over him, the baby turned his face towards her, and his lips curved into what seemed to be a smile of recognition. "Good morning, little warrior," Deborah whispered, and was rewarded with an animated guttural sound. "I managed to schedule an appointment with Dr. Felicity for tomorrow," Maurice informed. "She was hesitant at first until I mentioned your name. It seems you two know each other." Deborah nodded. "We worked together for a short period at St. Thomas's Hospital before she opened her own clinic. She's an exceptional professional and, more importantly, extremely ethical." The rest of the morning was dedicated to small experiments to document Michael's progress. Using colorful toys and lanterns of different intensities, Maurice and Deborah recorded each of the baby's reactions, how his eyes followed moving objects, how he reacted to different colors, how he turned towards sounds. "It's like we're meeting our son for the first time," Maurice commented, emotional, as he watched Michael's eyes follow a red ball that Deborah moved slowly in front of him. Around 10 in the morning, the intercom in the room rang. It was Eleanor, announcing that Dr. Henry was on the phone. Maurice cast a worried glance at Deborah before answering. The conversation was brief and tense. Yes, doctor, we are following your prescription. No significant changes. Yes, I understand the importance of regularity. I await your visit next week, as usual. After hanging up, Maurice seemed disturbed. He insisted on the importance of not missing any dose of the eye drops. He said there could be serious consequences for Michael's ocular health if the treatment was interrupted. Deborah frowned. That doesn't make sense. If Michael truly has an irreversible optic nerve lesion, as was diagnosed, what difference would it make to interrupt eye drops that supposedly only serve to preserve ocular health? Exactly my thought. Maurice walked to the window pensive. There's something very strange about this whole story. While Maurice was absent for some unavoidable virtual meetings, Deborah dedicated herself to a more thorough examination of Michael's room. She looked for any medical documentation, prescriptions, or additional information about the prescribed treatment. At the back of a dresser drawer, she found a folder containing medical exams and reports. Among the documents, a tomography report signed by Dr. Henry and another doctor stood out. Dr. Richard Mason, a neuroradiologist. The diagnosis was clear and definitive: bilateral optic nerve atrophy, with no possibility of functional recovery. Deborah photographed the documents with her cell phone to study them more calmly later and continued her search. It was then that she found, in a small box at the back of the closet, 3 other bottles of the same eye drops, all with different expiration dates. The most recent had expired only a week ago. Why keep expired bottles? She murmured to herself, intrigued. Her investigation was interrupted by Maurice's return, who carried a large, colourful box. I found this in storage, he explained, opening the box to reveal a collection of mobiles and sensory toys. Caroline had bought them for the baby's room. I thought we could use them now. The two spent the next hour installing a colourful mobile over the crib and strategically positioning toys around the room. Michael, placed on an activity mat, watched everything with evident fascination, his little eyes moving from one object to another. During the afternoon, while Maurice participated in an important video conference, Deborah took the opportunity to conduct another crucial test, the bath. Without the effect of the eye drops, Michael's reactions to the water and foam were even more pronounced. He not only blinked when the foam approached his eyes, but now laughed openly, following the movement with his gaze and even extending his little hands to touch it. "Mama," he babbled, looking directly at Deborah. "Yes. Little one, it's the foam," she replied, tears in her eyes. "You're seeing the foam, aren't you?" When Maurice returned and witnessed the scene, he was so emotional that he had to lean against the door. "He's playing." Deborah nodded, discreetly wiping a tear, and seeing every moment of it. After the bath, with Michael dressed and comfortably settled in his crib, Deborah shared her morning discoveries with Maurice, the expired bottles stored away, and the medical report signed by 2 doctors. "We need to confront this data with Dr. Felicity's opinion," she suggested, "and it would also be important to take these bottles for analysis. There might be something in the content beyond what is described on the label." Maurice agreed, his expression hardening with determination. "I will request a complete analysis at an independent laboratory, and depending on what we discover, I will take appropriate legal action." The following morning was one of intense preparation for the appointment with Dr. Felicity. Deborah helped Maurice organize all medical documents, the eye drop bottles, and a detailed record of the observations made over the past 48 hours. Dr. Felicity Oliver's clinic, located in a modern building in Notting Hill, was a striking contrast to Dr. Henry's luxurious and traditional office. Colourful environments, playful decor, and a young team created a welcoming atmosphere for the children treated. Dr. Felicity herself greeted them personally at the reception, a woman in her early 40s with short, practical hair and lively eyes behind modern glasses. "Deborah," she exclaimed, embracing her former colleague with genuine affection. "It's been so long. Thank you for seeing us so urgently, Felicity," Deborah replied. Then introducing Maurice and Michael. The doctor greeted Maurice with a firm handshake and then leaned over Michael, who was in his father's arms. "Hello, little man. Shall we take a look at those beautiful eyes?" To everyone's surprise, Michael reached out his little hand and touched the stethoscope hanging around the doctor's neck, attracted by the metallic glint. "Well, that already tells us a lot," Dr. Felicity commented, smiling. Shall we go to the examination room? The initial tests were simple. Pupillary responses to different light intensities, visual tracking tests with colored objects, reflex assessment, and a detailed observation of the ocular structure with specific equipment. After almost an hour of meticulous examinations, Dr. Felicity sat before Maurice and Deborah with a serious expression, yet not devoid of hope. "Let's be direct," she began. "Michael definitely has functional vision. I cannot precisely state how much he sees at this moment, as visual acuity assessment in infants is complex, but there is pupillary response, visual tracking, and interest in colorful and contrasting objects. This directly contradicts the diagnosis of total blindness due to optic nerve atrophy." Maurice took a deep breath as if an immense weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "So the previous exams were wrong?" The doctor adjusted her glasses, thoughtful. "That's the intriguing part. I analyzed the reports you brought, and they seem technically correct. The images do indeed show an alteration in the optic nerve structure, but—" She paused. "There are inconsistencies." "What kind of inconsistencies?" Deborah asked, leaning forward. "The images have date and time markers, but the acquisition protocols are different from each other, although they were supposedly performed on the same equipment. Furthermore, the described atrophy is so severe that it would be incompatible with any visual response, even the most basic." "What does that mean?" Maurice questioned, confused. Dr. Felicity took a deep breath before responding. "It means we need to consider two possibilities. Either there was a gross error of interpretation, which is hard to believe considering the experience of the doctors involved, or—" She hesitated. "Or the images were deliberately altered," Deborah completed, verbalizing what the doctor hesitated to say. "It's a serious accusation," Dr. Felicity pondered. "But yes, it's a possibility we cannot rule out." Maurice ran his hands over his face, processing the enormity of that suggestion. "What about the eye drops? We brought the bottles so you could analyze them." The doctor examined the bottles carefully. "Modified phenylephrine hydrochloride, 2.5% concentration. This is an experimental medication, rarely prescribed and certainly not indicated for Michael's diagnosed condition." She frowned. "And they're all expired." "What exactly do these eye drops do?" Maurice asked. "In its standard formulation, phenylephrine dilates the pupil for ophthalmological examinations. In this modified concentration, it is used in some experimental protocols for intraocular pressure control in specific cases of congenital glaucoma." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "One of the known side effects in infants is the temporary suppression of visual and motor responses. In simple terms, it can make the child temporarily less visually responsive and more lethargic." A heavy silence fell over the room as everyone assimilated the implication of that information. "Are you saying that this medication could be artificially causing symptoms of blindness in Michael?" Maurice's voice trembled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "It's a possibility we need to investigate seriously," Dr. Felicity replied cautiously. "I strongly recommend that these bottles be sent for independent laboratory analysis. Meanwhile, my recommendation is clear. Completely suspend the use of the eye drops and immediately begin an appropriate visual stimulation protocol." Before they left the clinic, the doctor provided them with a detailed report of her evaluation, contrasting with previous diagnoses, and a complete visual stimulation plan for the coming weeks. "I want to see Michael again in a week," she instructed. "And Maurice, if you intend to take legal action, which I would fully support in this case, I suggest you document absolutely everything. Michael's reactions, times, behaviors, progress. Any detail can be crucial." On the way back to the mansion, Maurice was silent, absorbed in his thoughts. It was only when they parked at the entrance that he finally verbalized what tormented him. "Why, Deborah? Why would someone do this to a helpless child? What would be the purpose?" Deborah adjusted Michael in her arms, the baby now sleeping peacefully after the long morning of exams. "I don't know, sir, but I promise we will find out. And more importantly, we will help Michael recover everything that was taken from him." That night, as Michael slept under the colorful mobile that now gently spun over his crib, Maurice Kensington began what would be one of the most important battles of his life. In his office, surrounded by medical documents and preliminary legal reports, he made a silent promise. The truth would come to light, and those responsible for harming his son would face the full force of his influence and resources. The darkness imposed on Michael was beginning to dissipate, revealing not only the light of the world around him, but also the shadow of a scheme that Maurice suspected could extend far beyond his son's case. The following weeks transformed the Kensington mansion. What was once a silent and gloomy environment became a space of daily discoveries and celebrations. Every new reaction from Michael, every small progress was documented and celebrated as a victory against the obscurantism that almost stole his childhood. Following Dr. Felicity's recommendations, Deborah and Maurice implemented an intensive visual stimulation program. The curtains remained open during the day, allowing abundant natural light to enter. The walls of the room, previously in neutral tones, were decorated with high-contrast panels, black and white to stimulate basic visual perception, and gradually incorporating vibrant colors as Michael demonstrated responsiveness to them. "Look how he follows the red ball," Maurice commented during a play session, moving the colorful object slowly from side to side. Michael, lying on his activity mat, followed the movement with wide eyes and occasionally stretched out his hands, trying to reach it. Deborah, who documented the scene with her cell phone camera, smiled. "His hand-eye coordination is improving every day. It's incredible how he's made up for lost time." The preliminary report from the laboratory analysis of the eye drop bottles had arrived, confirming the darkest suspicions. The phenylephrine concentration was significantly higher than indicated on the label, at levels that could easily cause prolonged visual suppression in an infant. Even more disturbing, traces of a mild sedative, not declared in the original composition, were detected. With this evidence in hand, Maurice had initiated legal proceedings against Dr. Henry Maxwell and the associated ophthalmology clinic. In parallel, he had requested an independent investigation into the imaging exams that had led to Michael's initial diagnosis. "The lawyers are optimistic," he commented during dinner, as he watched Michael in his high chair, now interested in everything around him, especially the shiny cutlery that reflected the light. "The evidence is compelling, and Dr. Felicity has agreed to testify about the inconsistency of the original reports." "What about Dr. Richard Mason, the neuroradiologist who signed the reports along with Dr. Henry?" Deborah asked, helping Michael hold his spoon, an object the baby showed particular fascination for. "That's where the story gets even stranger," Maurice replied, lowering his voice despite being alone in the dining room. "My investigators discovered that he left the country almost 3 months ago, shortly after Michael's diagnosis. He's supposedly doing an extended internship at a hospital in Switzerland, but there are no official records of his professional activity there." Deborah frowned, disturbed by the implication. "That sounds like fleeing?" "Yes, we thought the same, especially considering it's not the first case." "What do you mean?" Maurice hesitated, as if pondering how much he should reveal. "My legal team found at least 3 other cases of children diagnosed with severe visual problems in the last 2 years, all treated by Dr. Henry with similar experimental protocols. In 2 of these cases, the families eventually sought second opinions and discovered inconsistencies in the diagnoses." "My God," Deborah murmured, instinctively moving closer to Michael. "This suggests a systematic pattern." "Exactly. Which leads us to question, why? What would be the motive for deliberately diagnosing and medicating children incorrectly?" The answer to that question began to emerge a few days later, when Maurice's investigators discovered a connection between Dr. Henry and a pharmaceutical company called BioVision Therapeutics, specializing in experimental ophthalmological medications. Dr. Henry not only receives funding from this company for clinical research, so it also holds a significant equity stake in it, Maurice explained, showing Deborah the obtained documents. "And guess what medication is in the final phase of MHRA approval, with the potential to become a blockbuster in pediatric glaucoma treatment? Modified phenylephrine hydrochloride," Deborah concluded, feeling a shiver run down her spine. "In the same formulation that was used in Michael. Regulatory approval depends on clinical studies demonstrating efficacy and safety. And what better way to control the results of these studies than by manipulating the patients themselves and their diagnoses?" The indignation Deborah felt at that moment was almost physical. The idea of using innocent children as involuntary guinea pigs to advance financial interests was abominable on a level she could barely process. These children, their parents believing they were blind or nearly blind, all the lost development. It won't go unpunished, Maurice guaranteed, his voice firm. We have already notified the competent authorities. The General Medical Council has been informed, as has the MHRA. The investigation is just beginning, but it will get to the bottom of this, no matter the cost. While the legal case unfolded behind the scenes, the routine at the mansion focused on Michael's recovery and development. Regular visits to Dr. Felicity confirmed constant progress. His vision, although not yet fully accessible due to age, showed all signs of being functional and potentially normal with proper stimulation. What we are observing is fascinating from a neurological point of view, the doctor explained during a consultation. The human brain, especially in babies, has incredible plasticity. Despite the prolonged visual suppression caused by the eye drops, as soon as the causative agent was removed, the neural circuits began to reorganize and strengthen. It's as if his brain was starved for visual stimuli and is now absorbing everything with redoubled intensity. The therapeutic program had been expanded to include sessions with an early stimulation specialist who visited the mansion 3 times a week. Deborah actively participated in these sessions, learning techniques she could apply on other days, and gradually taking on a role that went far beyond her original duties as a household employee. "You have a natural talent for this," the therapist commented, after observing Deborah conduct a series of visual fixation exercises with Michael. "Have you considered formally specializing in the area?" The question caught Deborah by surprise. After the loss of her son, she had completely abandoned the idea of resuming her training in the health field. But now, seeing the impact her knowledge and intuition had had on Michael's life, something rekindled in her heart. "Perhaps it's time to consider it," she replied, as she watched Michael play with a mirror, fascinated by his own reflection, an activity that would be impossible for a truly blind child. That night, after putting Michael to sleep, a process that now included a book of contrasting figures and a special flashlight that projected colorful shapes onto the ceiling, Deborah found Maurice on the terrace, contemplating the lights of London. "Is he asleep?" the businessman asked, offering her a chair beside him. "Yes, after a lot of visual exploration," she replied with a smile. "He's getting more and more curious." "How did you know?" The question came suddenly. "How did you perceive what no one else, not even me, managed to see?" Deborah was silent for a moment, organizing her thoughts. "I think it was a combination of factors. My previous experience with children, certainly, but also," she hesitated, "when you lose something precious, your senses become more acute to the value of what others have. After Louis Edward was gone, I became more attentive to every expression, every movement, every possibility in other children. Perhaps that's what made me notice what others ignored in Michael." Maurice nodded slowly. "Whatever the reason, I will be eternally grateful. You not only saved my son's sight, but you will probably help save many other children when this case comes to light." "How is the process progressing?" "Advancing. Dr. Henry was formally notified yesterday. His initial defense was pathetic. He claimed he was following approved experimental protocols and that the parents had been duly informed. We have documents proving the contrary, of course." He paused. "The hardest part will be in the coming days, when the press inevitably discovers the story. We need to prepare for the media circus that will form. Do you think it will affect Michael?" "I will do everything in my power to protect him. I've hired an additional security team and instructed Eleanor not to allow anyone onto the property without my express authorization." He looked directly at Deborah. "This means your presence will be even more important. Michael has gotten used to you. He needs stability in the midst of this storm." "I'll be here," she promised without hesitation. The following morning, Maurice's predictions were confirmed. The story had leaked to the press and, even before breakfast, the mansion gates were surrounded by reporters and television crews. Sensationalist headlines were already circulating on online news portals. "Billionaire heir victim of medical fraud," "Macabre scheme at elite clinic," "Babies falsely diagnosed as blind," "Celebrity doctor accused of using children as guinea pigs." "Don't pay any attention to it," Maurice instructed the household staff during an emergency meeting. No one speaks to the press under any circumstances. All communications will be made through our legal advisors. While the outside world buzzed with controversy, inside the mansion, Deborah kept Michael on his stimulation routine. That afternoon, during a session with mirrors and shiny objects, the baby reached another important milestone. Upon seeing his reflection in the mirror, he laughed openly and clearly pronounced Baba, his first real attempt at verbal communication beyond previous guttural sounds. "Let's film this to show your dad," Deborah commented excitedly, positioning her phone to capture the moment. Michael, as if understanding, repeated the feat with even more enthusiasm, adding hand and leg movements that demonstrated his excitement. That video, shared with Morris as he dealt with the media crisis in his office, brought tears to the businessman's eyes. Amidst the public storm forming around the case, it was moments like that which reaffirmed the importance of the battle they were fighting. For him, Maurice murmured to himself, watching the video repeatedly, before returning to endless calls with lawyers, authorities, and eventually other parents who began to emerge with eerily similar stories about Dr. Henry Maxwell and his questionable diagnoses. 3 months had passed since the discovery of the fraudulent scheme involving Dr. Henry Maxwell. During this period, the case ceased to be just a media scandal and became one of the most talked-about processes in the country's medical and legal circles. What began as a father's personal journey in search of justice for his son transformed into a broader crusade that threatened to expose systemic failures in the oversight of experimental drugs and medical ethics. Maurice Kensington, with his financial resources and influence, ensured that the investigation was conducted with rigor and swiftness. Each week new discoveries came to light, each more disturbing than the last. "We found 5 more families," reported Dr. Augustus Miller, the lead attorney for the case, during a meeting in the mansion's office, all with practically identical stories. Infants or young children diagnosed with severe visual problems by Dr. Henry, all subjected to the same experimental protocol with modified phenylephrine hydrochloride. "And the results after suspending the medication?" Maurice asked as he adjusted the camera monitoring Michael playing on the nearby mat, now clearly able to select toys by color and shape. "Varied, but promising in all cases. Older children, who spent more time on medication, show slower but consistent recovery. Infants, like Michael, are responding extraordinarily well to visual stimulation." Deborah, who had been officially incorporated into the process as a key witness, in addition to maintaining her expanded role as Michael's primary caregiver, listened attentively to the conversation while supervising the little one's activities. "What about Dr. Richard Mason, the radiologist?" she asked, referring to the doctor who had signed the reports along with Dr. Henry. The lawyer exchanged a meaningful look with Maurice before responding. "He was located in Ireland, not Switzerland as he claimed. He is cooperating with the investigations in exchange for a reduced sentence. His statements are devastating." "What did he reveal?" Deborah insisted, feeling there was more to this story than they were initially sharing. Maurice sighed deeply. "According to Mason, the scheme is much larger than we imagined. It's not just Dr. Henry and his clinic. There are BioVision Therapeutics executives directly involved, as well as possible connections with members of the MHRA Approval Committee. A corruption scheme for accelerated drug approval," Deborah concluded, horrified by the implications. "Exactly. Mason confessed that he systematically falsified imaging exams to create evidence of non-existent pathologies or exaggerate real conditions. The objective was twofold: to justify experimental treatments with modified phenylephrine hydrochloride, and subsequently, to document miraculous improvements that would be attributed to the drug. But how did they explain the evident visual suppression caused by the eye drops? Deborah questioned, unable to comprehend the perverse logic of the scheme. "That's the most sinister part," the lawyer interjected. "For parents and regulatory authorities, the narrative was that patients had severe degenerative visual conditions. The eye drops supposedly stabilized the condition, preventing worsening. Any visual suppression was attributed to the natural progression of the disease, which would have been much worse without treatment. Eventually, after a predetermined period, they gradually reduced the medication concentration, allowing improvements that were then documented as miraculous recovery attributed to the drug. A perfect scheme, Maurice concluded bitterly. If the child improved, the credit went to the medication. If they worsened, it was the fault of the inevitably progressive disease. Deborah felt nauseous contemplating the calculating coldness behind the plan. And the parents? How did no one question it? Some did question, the lawyer explained. But they were dealing with prestigious doctors, diagnoses apparently backed by sophisticated exams, and the promise of participating in cutting-edge treatments that could help their children. Furthermore, Dr. Henry had a particular talent for selecting vulnerable families, desperate parents, often in situations of grief or trauma, as was Maurice's case after the accident. Michael, oblivious to the somber conversation occurring a few feet away, let out a joyful laugh as he successfully fitted a colorful piece into his toy. Deborah and Maurice exchanged a look laden with emotion. Despite the indignation they felt, there was right in front of them living proof that not all was lost. The preliminary hearing is scheduled for next week, the lawyer informed, consulting his agenda. Judge Carmen Albright will be responsible for the case. She has an excellent reputation and is known for her rigorous stance in cases involving health fraud. What about the other families? Will they be present? Maurice asked. 3 of them confirmed participation. The other 2 are still processing the impact of the discovery. It's understandable. It's not easy to accept that you were manipulated in this way and that your child suffered unnecessarily. After the lawyer's departure, Maurice joined Deborah and Michael on the activity mat. The baby, now almost 10 months old, was increasingly active and communicative. His blue eyes, once fixed and empty, now shone with curiosity and intelligence. When he saw his father approach, he extended his arms in a clear request to be picked up. "He's so connected," Maurice commented, lifting his son into his arms. "It's hard to imagine what it would be like if you hadn't realized what was happening." "Let's not think about that," Deborah replied softly. "The important thing is that we realized in time, and now other parents will also have the chance to recover what was almost lost." On the morning of the preliminary hearing, the tension at the mansion was palpable. Maurice, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, seemed strangely vulnerable as he said goodbye to Michael, who would remain in Deborah's care. "You'll do great," she assured him, adjusting his tie in an almost maternal gesture. "The truth is on your side." The Crown Court was surrounded by reporters and cameras when Maurice arrived, accompanied by his legal team. The case had captured national attention, not only because of the high-profile individuals involved, but also because of the shocking nature of the accusations. Inside the courtroom, Dr. Henry Maxwell was already waiting, accompanied by his lawyers. His demeanor, once confident and authoritative, now appeared worn and tense. When his gaze met Maurice's, he quickly looked away, unable to sustain the intensity of the paternal indignation. Judge Carmen Albright, a woman in her 60s with keen eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses, conducted the proceedings with precise efficiency. After the formal presentations and the reading of the accusations, the testimonies began. Dr. Richard Mason was the first to testify, confirming under oath his participation in the scheme of falsifying exams and diagnoses. His meticulous account included specific dates, names, and procedures, creating a devastating portrait of years of systematic fraud. "How many patients in total, Dr. Mason?" the judge asked at one point. "At least 17 children in the last 3 years, Your Honor," was the answer that provoked horrified murmurs in the room. The representatives of BioVision Therapeutics attempted to distance themselves from the scandal, claiming ignorance of Dr. Henry's actions. However, emails and documents presented by the prosecution clearly showed the involvement of high-ranking executives in monitoring and funding the doctor's special cases. When it was Maurice's turn to testify, the room was in absolute silence. In a firm voice, he recounted the months of despair after Michael's diagnosis, the trust placed in Dr. Henry, and the gradual discovery, thanks to Deborah, that his son had been the victim of an elaborate fraud. Michael lived his first 7 months in an artificially imposed darkness, he concluded, with restrained emotion. Not just because of a mistaken diagnosis, but because of a medication deliberately administered to suppress his visual capacity. All in the name of profit and academic prestige. One of the most impactful moments of the hearing was the video testimony of other affected families. Fathers and mothers who, like Maurice, had lived the despair of believing their children would never see normally, only to later discover that the condition had been induced or exaggerated. When Deborah was called to testify, her discreet but determined presence commanded immediate respect. Unlike the specialists who had testified earlier, she possessed no academic titles or impressive credentials, only her experience as a nursing assistant and, more importantly, her maternal instinct sharpened by her own loss. "Ms. Shaw," Maurice's lawyer began, "could you describe to the court how you first suspected Michael Kensington's condition?" With simplicity and clarity, Deborah narrated her observations. The baby's unusual behavior, even for someone with visual impairment, the reaction to foam during the bath, the discovery of the expired eye drops, the research she conducted, the pattern of lethargy after medication, and reactivity as the effect diminished. What led you to question the diagnosis when so many specialists had confirmed it? The judge asked, genuinely intrigued. Deborah took a deep breath before answering. "I was hired to be a household employee, Your Honor, but I am a mother above all else. I lost my son, Louis Edward, 6 months before I met Michael. That experience, it changes your perspective. You see details that others might overlook, especially when they are overshadowed by titles and expectations." Dr. Henry's defense attempted, unsuccessfully, to discredit Deborah's testimony, questioning her background and suggesting she was emotionally compromised due to the loss of her own son. The strategy, however, proved counterproductive when Deborah responded with dignity. "Yes, I am emotionally involved, as any human being would be, to see an innocent child deprived of the basic right to see the world around them. I don't need diplomas hanging on the wall to recognize when something is wrong with a baby." The hearing extended for 2 more days, with independent experts confirming the analysis of the adulterated eye drops and pediatric ophthalmology, specialists contesting the validity of the original diagnoses made by Dr. Henry. In the end, Judge Carmen Albright announced her decision. The case would proceed to a full trial. With Dr. Henry Maxwell, 2 BioVision Therapeutics executives, and a member of the MHRA Approval Committee formally indicted for multiple crimes, including medical fraud, document falsification, improper administration of medication, and criminal conspiracy. Furthermore, the magistrate added, "I order the immediate freezing of all defendants' assets, the preventive suspension of Dr. Henry Maxwell's medical license while the process is ongoing, and the immediate suspension of all clinical studies related to modified phenylephrine hydrochloride." The decision was met with restrained applause in the courtroom. For Maurice, although it represented an important victory, it was only the beginning of a larger battle. Upon leaving the court, facing the tumult of reporters and cameras, his words were direct and resonated on the news that night. "Today we take the first step towards justice, not just for Michael, my son, but for all the children who are victims of this unspeakable fraud. May this case serve as a warning. When it comes to the health of our children, we will spare no effort to hold accountable those who abuse the trust placed in the medical profession." Back at the mansion, he found Deborah and Michael in the garden, enjoying the sunny late afternoon. The baby, sitting on a colorful blanket, manipulated a collection of wooden blocks with increasing dexterity, clearly selecting them by color. "How did it go?" Deborah asked, though she already knew the answer from the notifications she had received on her phone. "We won this stage," Maurice replied, sitting beside his son, who immediately offered him a red block. "But the road is still long. The main trial will likely take months. The important thing is that other children will be spared," Deborah commented, watching the interaction between father and son with affection. "Thanks to you," Maurice added with a look of deep gratitude. "Without your perception, your instinct, who knows how much longer Michael would have remained in that artificial darkness." Michael, as if understanding he was the topic of conversation, looked up at the 2 adults and for the first time clearly pronounced, "Mama." The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Deborah felt tears well up instantly, a complex mixture of joy for Michael's progress and longing for her own son who would never say that word. "He's speaking earlier than average," she commented, trying to maintain her composure. "It's a great sign of cognitive development." Maurice, however, perceived the depth of that moment. "He knows exactly what he's saying, Deborah, and who you've become to him." That night, after putting Michael to sleep, a process that now included a storybook with colorful figures, which the baby watched with fascination, Deborah allowed herself a few moments of solitary reflection in the mansion garden. The stars shone brightly in the London sky, visible even with the metropolis's light pollution. "You guided me to him, didn't you, my little one?" she murmured, as if speaking to the son she had lost. "So I could help him see the stars too." A year had passed since the preliminary hearing that exposed Dr. Henry Maxwell's criminal scheme. During this period, life at the Kensington mansion transformed completely. What was once an environment of mourning and silence became a space of light, colors, and children's laughter. Michael, now almost 1 year and 9 months old, was developing by leaps and bounds. His vision, according to the most recent examinations performed by Dr. Felicity, was within normal parameters for a child his age, with only a slight sensitivity to very intense light, a minimal sequela considering what could have been lost. The visual stimulation program, initially intensive and structured, had been gradually incorporated into everyday play. Games of colors, contrasts, shapes, and depth were part of the daily routine, transforming learning into fun. "Look, Daddy," Michael exclaimed animatedly, running through the living room with a colorful airplane in his hand, his eyes perfectly capable of avoiding obstacles in his path. His vocabulary grew daily, as did his motor coordination and cognitive abilities, all functions that could have been severely compromised if the fraud had not been discovered in time. Maurice watched his son with a mixture of pride and gratitude that never diminished no matter how many months passed. "I see, champion. What a fast plane." Deborah entered the room carrying a tray with the afternoon snack. Her position in the house had changed drastically over the year. From household employee to primary caregiver, she now occupied a role difficult to define, part of the family, specialized educator, and a fundamental pillar in Michael's development. "Snack time, pilot," she called with a loving smile. "Mommy, look!" Michael ran to her, showing the airplane. The word mommy, initially an accidental babble, had solidified as the way the boy chose to call her. Neither Maurice nor Deborah had corrected the child's natural choice. Both understood that motherhood went far beyond biological ties. "What an incredible airplane," Deborah replied, placing the tray on the coffee table and bending down to Michael's height. "Let's refuel the pilot with a snack, and then we can build an airport with the blocks. What do you think?" The boy nodded enthusiastically, his blue eyes, so much like his biological mother's, shining with anticipation. The connection between Deborah and Michael was something that fascinated everyone who saw them interact, a natural harmony that transcended conventional explanations. During the snack, Maurice discreetly checked his phone, where he had received an important notification. "The final trial has been scheduled for next week," he announced in a low voice to Deborah, while Michael was distracted with his sandwich cut into geometric shapes, another of the visual games Deborah incorporated into daily activities. "Finally," she replied, with a sigh that mingled relief and apprehension. The case had dragged on longer than expected, with the defendant's defense using every possible resource to prolong the process. "Dr. Augustus is confident," Maurice continued. "The evidence is overwhelming, and 2 more families have joined the lawsuit in recent months. The impact of the case had crossed national borders, being cited in international medical publications as a warning about the need for greater rigor in the oversight of clinical studies and experimental protocols." Michael's story, the baby who saw the foam, as some journalists nicknamed him, had become emblematic of how parental vigilance and attention to small details could make the difference between a life of limitations and full development. Parallel to the criminal proceedings, Maurice had launched a foundation dedicated to raising awareness about pediatric diagnoses and supporting families of children with real visual impairments. The Michael's Light Foundation, as it was named, had already helped dozens of families obtain second medical opinions and access to appropriate treatments. That night, after putting Michael to sleep with the usual session of illustrated books, now a passion of the boys, Deborah found Maurice in his office, reviewing documents related to the case. "Nervous about the trial?" she asked, bringing 2 cups of tea. Not about the result itself, he replied, accepting the cup with gratitude, but about the exposure. The media coverage will be intense, and that will inevitably affect Michael, even if we try to protect him. Deborah nodded understandingly. He's resilient, Maurice, and still too young to fully understand what happened. When he's older and understands, he'll see that his father fought for him and for many other children. We fought, he corrected with a meaningful look. This victory, whatever the formal outcome of the trial, will be as much yours as mine. A week later, the London Crown Court was completely surrounded by journalists and television crews from across the country. The trial of the case that became known as the blindfolded eyes scheme had captured the public imagination like few before it. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was solemn. Dr. Henry Maxwell and the other defendants occupied their seats, visibly dejected after months of negative public exposure and accumulated evidence against them. Judge Carmen Albright, the same who had presided over the preliminary hearing, conducted the proceedings with the same impeccable efficiency. After a week of final testimonies, confrontation of evidence and arguments from both sides, the moment of the verdict arrived. This court, the magistrate began, adjusting her glasses with a gesture that had become familiar to those present, rarely encounters cases that so alarmingly combine the violation of physician-patient trust with the exploitation of children's and families' vulnerability. In moments of extreme fragility, the room remained in absolute silence as she continued. The evidence presented demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendants deliberately engaged in a coordinated scheme to falsely diagnose visual conditions in children, administer medications that temporarily suppressed their visual capabilities, and use these cases as part of fraudulent clinical studies, aiming for regulatory approval and subsequent commercial profit. Maurice, seated in the front row beside his lawyer, remained impassive, although his posture revealed the accumulated tension of months of legal battle. Considering the gravity of the crimes, the impact on the lives of the victims, innocent children deprived of critical visual development in their early years of life, and the systemic violation of fundamental ethical principles of medicine, this court declares all defendants guilty of all charges presented. A murmur ran through the room, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Dr. Henry Maxwell is sentenced to 12 years imprisonment for medical fraud, document falsification, improper administration of medication, and criminal conspiracy. His medical license will be permanently revoked, and his assets will be used to compensate the affected families. The sentences for the other defendants were equally severe: 10 years for the BioVision Therapeutics executives, and 8 years for the corrupt member of the MHRA Approval Committee. Furthermore, the pharmaceutical company was fined record amounts and prohibited from conducting clinical studies in the UK for the next 15 years. Finally, the judge concluded, "This court recommends a complete review of pediatric drug approval protocols and an independent investigation of all clinical studies currently underway involving infant patients. The present case revealed systemic failures that cannot be ignored if we wish to protect our children from similar exploitation in the future." Upon leaving the court, Maurice was surrounded by reporters eager for statements. With dignity and restraint, he offered only one sentence that would be widely reproduced in the news that night. Today, justice saw what had almost gone unnoticed, that every child deserves to see the world with their own eyes, not through the distorted lenses of commercial interests. That same day, while the verdict dominated national news, Deborah and Michael participated in a special session at the Michael's Light Foundation. A group of children with real visual impairments, some partially blind, others with treatable conditions, others with permanent limitations, participated in an innovative multi-sensory stimulation program developed based on Michael's experience. "See, Michael, this little friend is learning to recognize shapes by touch, because his little eyes see differently from yours," Deborah patiently explained as the boy watched, fascinated, an older child manipulating textured blocks while blindfolded. Michael, with his natural curiosity, approached the other boy and spontaneously offered him one of the colorful blocks he was holding. The simple gesture, from a child who had almost lost his sight to another who truly had visual limitations, moved the therapists present. Weeks later, the British Association for Supporting Visually Impaired Children organized a special ceremony to honor individuals who had contributed significantly to advancements in the field. Among those honored were renowned doctors, researchers, specialized educators, and, to the surprise of many, Deborah Shaw. The auditorium was packed when the presenter called to the stage the woman who saw what no one else could see, Deborah Shaw, whose attention to detail and courage to question authorities saved Michael Kensington's sight and, indirectly, that of many other children. With Michael in her arms and Maurice by her side, Deborah went up to the stage to receive a symbolic medal. The boy, dazzled by the stage lights and attention, looked directly at her and, with surprising clarity for his age, pronounced the words that definitively sealed their bond. "Mommy Light!" The audience erupted in applause, many with tears in their eyes as they witnessed that moment of pure connection. The presenter, recovering from the emotion, announced that a second medal would be awarded, this time to Michael himself. For seeing, he simply explained, as he placed a small silver ribbon medal around the boy's neck. On the way home, Michael fell asleep in the car, exhausted by the day's emotions, the medal still hanging around his neck. Maurice and Deborah exchanged a meaningful look, the kind of look that dispenses with words between people who have shared a transformative journey. The following months brought a series of positive changes. The Michael's Light Foundation expanded, establishing partnerships with hospitals and research centers dedicated to children's ocular health. Pediatric drug approval protocols were revised and strengthened, with new oversight mechanisms implemented. More significantly, the medical records of all children affected by Dr. Henry's scheme were corrected, and personalized treatments were developed for each case. Some, like Michael, recovered completely. Others, who had spent more time on improper medication, showed mild sequelae, but all were on trajectories of constant improvement. At the Kensington mansion, now permanently bathed in the natural light that was once avoided, routine settled around Michael's daily development and discoveries. The home visual stimulation program continued, but in a more playful way. Colorful curtains opened every morning, shadow and light games in the afternoon, mirrors and shiny objects strategically positioned to capture the boy's curious attention. Maurice, transformed by the experience, had abandoned the guilty passivity that had characterized him in the first months after the accident. He had become a present and questioning father, constantly asking questions, learning about child development, documenting every one of Michael's achievements, not only as a record, but as living proof that attention and love could reverse even the bleakest prognoses. Deborah, in turn, had found a new direction for her life. With Maurice's encouragement, she resumed her studies, enrolling in an occupational therapy course specializing in child development. Her experience with Michael had become a case study cited in academic articles, and she was occasionally invited to share her story at medical conferences, always emphasizing that her greatest diagnostic instrument was not technical knowledge, but attentive presence and love. The relationship between Maurice and Deborah had evolved naturally into something that transcended conventional definitions. They were not just employer and employee, nor just co-caregivers of Michael. They were partners on a journey that had profoundly transformed them, united by a bond forged in adversity and strengthened by shared victory. One sunny afternoon, as they watched Michael chase rays of light projected onto the living room floor, one of his favorite games, Maurice expressed what he had been considering for months. "You are family now, Deborah. To Michael, to me. This house is your home if you want it to be." She smiled, understanding the implicit invitation. "It already is my home. You two are my family." Michael approached at that moment, holding a metallic spoon that captured and reflected the light, creating small rainbows on the wall. "Look, Mommy, Daddy, light!" The two adults exchanged a look of deep understanding as the boy spun, fascinated by the glow he himself created. The light that had almost been stolen from him was now his constant companion in discoveries. On the wall of Michael's room, framed simply, Maurice had placed a special photograph, his son, eyes wide with enchantment, holding a crystal prism against the light, observing the colors that formed. Below the photo, a simple inscription, "Michael, who saw the foam." That phrase, originally used by the press as a journalistic simplification, had become a powerful symbol within the family, a reminder of how an apparently insignificant detail, when observed by the right eyes, can change the course of an entire life. What began as a story of loss, isolation, and a desolate diagnosis had transformed, step by step, into a journey of discovery, reparation, and bonds that transcended the conventional. It was living proof that, when we remove the drops that blur our vision and the silences that paralyze our actions, life always finds a path towards the light. Michael, playing with his rays of light, was the most eloquent testimony to this truth. His eyes, which were almost condemned to an artificial darkness, now not only saw the world but recreated it daily, discovering wonders that only a truly free gaze can find. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Michael, Maurice, and Deborah's journey has touched your hearts. A story about how attention to small details can change entire lives. For more emotional narratives like this, we have prepared a special playlist that you can find by clicking here. If this story awakened something in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Daily, we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the transformative power of love. Tell us in the comments which moment of this narrative touched your heart the most. Your words inspire our next stories.